Dan Wu, KZSE Santa Cruz, Do Make Say Think in the background there, leading us in. This is Unquestionable. And I am in the studio we have Professor Grace Peña Delgado to talk about whatever we get to in the realm of immigration, nationalism, and I'm also curious to see how the U.S. and maybe other parts of the world or the global community itself right now ranks in history as far as its level of tolerance or hatred. Professor Delgado wrote the book Making the Chinese Mexican, about Chinese life and immigration and emigration and all kinds of things related to that in Sonora, Mexico, over the last century, mainly about 80 to 50 years ago. And we're going to have her come in and talk about all things related to that. So how's it going, Professor Delgado?
Oh, I'm doing well. How are you?
I am making it through, It's been a crazy decade, So, I think we're coming to a point where the kind of research that you've been doing and what you wrote in the 90s for your PhD struck me as really relevant to what's going on right now. And I want you to first introduce yourself to the listeners. What inspired you to write Making the Chinese Mexican about life in the borderlands of Arizona and Mexico, and how you feel that those lessons could be relevant today?
Okay, well, thank you for having me today. So I'd like to say, first and foremost, I'm a native Californian. My family is from Los Angeles, but they have a history of migratory labor in Central California as well as in Arizona. So typically, migratory families in the 1950s and 60s settled in Los Angeles and even before then. And so my family was part of that sort of inter-California diaspora into Central California, into Los Angeles. And my mother and my father were both migratory workers, and they met in Los Angeles where they married. So, but on my mother's side, she is an immigrant from Mexico who came here legally in 1944 with her family, who followed her father, who was here before the family came with my grandmother and her siblings. So that's my background, and I went to public schools in California, and Whittier in particular, and public institutions of higher learning, UCLA in particular. A point of which I am always very proud to share.
Now, going from that starting point of your background and the fact that you made a point of saying that you are a native Californian, now, can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese Mexican heritage that you wrote about in your book?
Right.
And you did talk about how the differences between being a citizen and being a non-citizen don't necessarily protect you from maybe discrimination or being pushed out of society in different ways. Can you tell people about what Making the Chinese Mexican is, what that concept is?
Right. So the concept is, I guess one takeaway is that citizenship does not always translate into assimilation or success or settlement. And that's the lesson on the Mexican side of the border, where the Chinese of Sonora and Mexico were accorded citizenship. They, in fact, over-succeeded. They were merchants, they were influencers, they intermarried, they had mixed, they intermarried women, and so they had Chinese-Mexican children. They became citizens, like I said. But in a wave of nationalism that was really turned against them in the 1920s and the 30s, they were forced from places like Sonora and Baja California and other places throughout Mexico, but in particular Sonora, to leave that state based on a heightened xenophobia in Mexico that followed their revolution. And it's important. It's an important historical example because it gets us away from seeing the United States with all of its grotesque examples of nationalism, and currently we are living in one of those moments. It gets us away from that type of narrowness to really encourage us to think about nationalism as it radiates in places other than the United States, so that we understand, even currently today, that there is a nationalist populist sweep spanning our globe that has commonalities with each other. And in Mexico, that nationalism had a lot of commonalities with the nationalism that also was radiating in the United States. But ironically, the Chinese in the United States, in the borderlands, who did not qualify for citizenship, they were insulated by local community politics and kin and kith relationships with the Mexican minority population. And those local adjustments and arrangements proved incredibly valuable insofar that they were never excluded or expelled from the country, but rather made assimilation and accommodation arrangements much differently, that not based on citizenship.
Now, when you talk about the Chinese at that time, the 20s and 30s, in the United States, in the region of the border, you're talking Chinese Americans in Los Angeles, San Diego, Arizona, all of these places. What was their life like if they weren't officially expelled from the country? They weren't given citizenship as they were in Mexico, right. But how long did the ones, I guess my question is, how long did the ones in Mexico reside there before they got citizenship? Were they born there? Were they second generation at the time of the 20s and 30s? Were they given citizenship right when they arrived as first generation? How did that work?
Right. Well, see, my study is about Chinese in the United States, in southern Arizona, including Tucson and some Phoenix. These are very small communities that were able to carve out arrangements that are very much unlike that of the Chinese communities in Los Angeles and San Francisco. So that's a distinction here that I draw in the book. So it's really borderlands. Okay. And those communities of Chinese in southern Arizona came from Mexico when they crossed the border. They also came from San Francisco in the 1880s, 1890s. Some came from places like Wyoming and Texas, and they settled alongside Mexican communities there that until the 1920s was the dominant political group in that region, which made for different types of ethnic and racial and political relations. In the 1880s, at the time of Chinese exclusion, in the 1890s, when exclusion is expanded and made much more pernicious, we see a number of Chinese people coming from Hong Kong wanting to settle in San Francisco, but they are refused landing. Or if they do land, they're held in detention for months, etc. To avoid that, what they do is they fly from San Francisco, they don't land, and they go to Mexico, where they do land, where immigration laws are much more accepting, not perfect, but at least allows them to land and create community. And the initial settlers of Chinese and Mexico were they were miners and agriculturalists, but later on, because of relationships that they had with the Chinese in San Francisco, there was a number of sort of these transnational networks of financing that allowed for the borrowing of money of Chinese miners and agriculturalists to become merchants. And it's that early history and their success as merchants in mining towns and agricultural communities that builds capital for these communities in Mexico, and it again was really the basis for their expulsion, ironically.
Yeah, so let's fast forward 30 or 40 years. What started, where do you see the tide turning in the mood of the Mexican public? And you talk about how even if the national Mexican state had maybe an accommodating immigration framework, that the ability of officials within that government to act on their own, you talk about localism, you talk about the ability of them to maybe pass a law and use local support for a law to supersede national immigration policy.
Well, yes.
And how did that tide turn? And what were some of the slogans or common justifications given for why we don't want these Chinese people here anymore?
In Mexico, it was the exclusion politics were based
specifically, in Mexico,
right.
in that 20s, 30s transition period.
They were based in the idea that the Chinese were taking jobs away from Mexicans, so an economic scare that really was buttressed by a racialized scare of miscegenation. So the Chinese who were succeeding were marrying the fairest Mexican women and producing, again, this is through a eugenics lens, producing Mongoloid types of Mexicans, right? Mexicans who were neither Mexican nor Chinese. So there was a racialized trope about Mexican-Chinese miscegenation that also buttressed economic nationalism that grew in the 1920s, and we see a number of Chinese during that period in Mexico being subject to direct violence, virulent xenophobia that involved the burning of businesses, the raping of their wives, the disassimilation of their children. And this was a campaign that was buttressed by the middle-class Mexicans who saw the Chinese as overly successful and threatening what few resources were available socially and economically in the North. So again, this should radiate with your viewers in terms of the parallels of nationalism, in this context, xenophobia, that history doesn't ever repeat itself. It simply rhymes, and these rhymes radiate globally in the United States at the same time against Mexicans, ironically, and I can go into some sort of explanation about that. But we see those resonances now.
And this circles back to what you said at the very beginning, making very prominent that I'm a native Californian. My grandparents came here.
Right.
My mom was a small child, but everyone else has been born here. You've lived your entire life as a U.S. citizen. These people, many of them, by the 1930s, had been born in Mexico to people that came there in the 1880s, 1890s, but still weren't seen as Mexican. And it's kind of nationalism overrides definitions of, say, racism, because all of a sudden they're in Mexico in that era, all of a sudden you have an equation of these whiter, more Spanish heritage Mexican people are Mexican,
Right.
and these darker native Mexican people are somehow Mexican.
Right.
But then all of a sudden these Chinese skinned people, essentially that's the only difference,
Right.
Chinese skinned people that were born here are now not Mexican. And we talk about birthright citizenship in the United States now, and you making a point, like, I was born here. A lot of people are thinking, well, it doesn't matter if you're born here. You are so-and-so heritage from 2 generations back. And that's kind of what happened in Sonora at a certain point, is people were expelled that had been born there, correct?
Absolutely. So Chinese Mexican children who were born to Mexican women were expelled. Now, there's something else going on here, too. In Mexico, and this does parallel with the United States, Mexican women who married Chinese men were denationalized. They were robbed of their Mexican citizenship.
Wow.
So a marriage would denationalize a woman who marries a foreigner, radiates with what had happened to women in the United States in the 1910s and the 1920s, who were also denationalized when they, surprisingly, you're getting a reaction here from you, Dan. Who were
I will put a camera in the studio for my show at some
please
point.
don't.
But
Yeah.
no, I mean, just so you can see reactions when I'm an
Right,
improper radio host and I don't say it out loud.
No, that's quite all right. So a lot of this history does surprise Americans who have this idea about gender equality around sexuality, sexual choices. And we enjoy those equalities today as a result of many civil rights movements and movements that, need to go much farther, and they will. I'm hopeful. But we take for granted that women who marry foreigners or international people remain citizens of their native country. And that was not the case for both American women and for Mexican women. But going back to Mexico, so the issue was that Mexican women, because they were non-citizens, did not have the claims of a Mexican person to protect herself and her family. And so what happens in the 1930s, 1931 in particular, when the state of Sonora officially expels its Chinese, the lack of citizenship for women to claim belonging as well as for their children is a non-entity. It's non-existent. So what we see is over 2,000 families, men, women, and their children going back to China, places like Hong Kong and Macau, and resettling. And a colleague of mine, Julia Esquivion Camacho, wrote a wonderful book called Chinese Mexicans. And she details the challenges of Chinese Mexican women who subsequently were abandoned by their Chinese husbands, their fight with the Mexican government to allow them to return to their native place as well as their children. And that fight does not conclude until the 1960s, when the Mexican government does allow for the repatriation of these Mexican women and their Chinese Mexican children from China.
I want to touch on that, because when this process takes so long for someone to get what they're asking for in court, some people may not want it anymore. I work with one person in particular who is the son of someone who came over when they were like, I don't know, early 20s, 18, early 20s from Mexico City. And this person is grown up in Watsonville, is very into California culture. I had no idea. I was like, this is some pretty boy from California. He loves hip hop. He loves like bleaching his hair and like, all these things that he's very Californian, very, very Californian in every way culturally that I can think of. And it just was made known to me recently that he came here when he was 4 years old from Mexico City. So he's actually an unofficial dreamer, and he goes to a university around here and all these things, where if he were ever sent, I was like, oh my God, you would hate being sent back to Mexico City. He's like, yeah. I'm like, you totally wouldn't survive there. Cause he's like total, like, he's like me. He's not knowing of culture in Mexico City to the point where if he was sent back, he would be sent back into another world. And can you talk about when something takes 40 years to get home, how did they even respond to it? Did they want to go home at that point?
Well, look, so you made a point when you said that I made a point that I was born here. I'm not sure if I made that point vociferous and as direct as you cast it, but I want to question that, because I think it might lead us to some interesting conversations.
For sure.
So the question is, why would someone like me, a Mexican American, a Chicana, a Mexicana in other groups, and that's how I identify, depending on who's around me, okay, why would I feel that burden?
You code switchers.
You're right. Why would I feel that burden to say, well, I was born here? Okay, so I ask that rhetorically because it is a political response by people like me to say, well, to you, Dan Wu, white American, I was born here. I have claims as a citizen. I'm going to draw on those claims. I am American of Mexican descent, and I understand with all the complexity what that means. I also know that people who you described, that individual, does not have those claims. That person does not have the claim to say, I'm an American, and claim citizenship. It might be ethnically that person is an American, far more than Mexican, but that individual does not have the power of the protection of birthright citizenship. And those are distinctions that were forced I think, upon us as a group of Mexicans and Latinos to start thinking about in terms of our own distinctions and differences amongst one another and what that means. And then the burden of having to say where we were born is also something that it is, unfortunately, is a burden for Mexican Americans, and really shouldn't be, because the issue of birthright and place of birth or not place of birth is a construction that is engendered in nationalism and racism, I believe. And I wish there were better ways in which to counter that.
So that leads me to something that I didn't email you in questions. This is why I don't usually email lists of questions to people, but especially if I'm going to debate them. I didn't approach that with this interview. But when you talk about this kid who we call Junior, which is actually a great alias for talking about it on the air, because it's like whatever.
Junior. Okay.
Yeah, like that's literally what we call him. It's just his nickname. But he not having that ability to make that claim, and then you having said it the first words out of your mouth, that's why it struck me so strong. Like whether you meant to or thought it was a strong statement, it sounds like to me a strong statement when I'm like, hey, take us through an intro of what making the Chinese American is. And you're like, I'm a native born Californian. But how does that in your life with all the people you talk to, whether it's in your family or other professors or other Mexican born immigrants or U.S. born Mexican heritage people, how do those conversations go when you talk about the difference between the person that can make that claim and the person that can't make that claim of being born here?
Well, it's understood as a burden imposed upon a group of people who are racially cast as aliens.
Whether you're born here or not, you're saying.
You bet. So it's a trope. So if you look Latino, Latinx, you are cast as illegal, Mexican and illegal, and perhaps even criminal. Those are the tropes and the burdens put upon Latinx communities, in particular Mexican people, but now Central Americans, that are tropes that emanate from really a white supremacist culture. So when we say we're born here or not born here, or talk about our families in terms of their genealogy and coming to the United States, it's just not history, even though I'm a historian and I write about this somewhat in my book. It's about addressing these tropes and being aware of them and being, at the same time, aware of them, very skeptical and even put off that this even has to be a discussion.
Well, unfortunately, it is a discussion that goes on all the time, but fortunately, it's a discussion we're having right now on KZSC Santa Cruz on this episode of Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu. We're going to be back in just a moment, hopefully with more from Professor Grace Peña Delgado, who is talking about her book as a starting point for a conversation. The book is Making the Chinese Mexican. Wow, we are just jumping borders in this conversation a ton.
Right.
So, yes, Making the Chinese Mexican is the book from 2012. But even then, much has changed in this country since then on these matters. We're going to be back in just a moment. I got a couple announcements to send out, and then we will be back with more Professor Grace Peña Delgado here on Unquestionable KZSC Santa Cruz. We're back here on KZSC Santa Cruz, back to Unquestionable. You're listening to me get corrected by Professor Grace Peña Delgado for the next hour, but I want to switch up the conversation a little bit and talk about this current wave of nationalism, nationalistic reactionary international, as Noam Chomsky recently called it. basically this wave across the earth, which he does note as his experience of being a teenager during World War II. He does not compare the current level of nationalistic thinking globally as the same as like Nazism and Mussolini's fascism of the 1930s and 40s. But he does say it's a very big threat to democracy, the way that people are hunkering down in all these different countries and saying, if you're not our countrymen, we want you out, or we want you not to be able to participate in society. How do you, Professor Delgado, rate the current U.S. form of nationalism as a U.S.-born Mexican heritage intellectual? How do you rate our current level of nationalism in the scale of other global movements and historical periods?
Well, I think that I wouldn't get much dispute if I said that the United States is really a trendsetter or a North Star in terms of setting political and social agenda. And that, that radiates in terms of foreign policy, economic policy, et cetera. And also it includes racialized policies. And so as the United States goes, many of our partners in Western Europe as well as in Latin America also go. And that's also the case with this burgeoning populist nationalist movement that is gaining a lot of traction in places like Latin America, Argentina, Brazil. We see that being played out in Venezuela, and of course we see that being played out in Western Europe. We can also see this weekend that the EU is having their parliamentary elections, and we see that the rise of the right through nationalist populism is also gaining a lot of traction and support. So it's going to be interesting in terms of the Brexit move, how the European Union fares in terms of its own border policies and economic policies that are ironically open and closed.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you have, on the one hand, for EU citizens, unfettered open borders. But on the other hand, Europe closes its borders in a militarized fashion, a securitized fashion, the way the United States has been doing this since the mid-1990s, through the borders of Spain and through Morocco, where you see Frontex is actually the name of the project, where they have U.S.-style militarism as a way in which to police borders. So on the one hand, you have unfettered immigration for one set of people. On the other hand, you have a military response to the refugee crisis emanating from Syria and from Turkey and from Northern Africa. Just like in the United States, you have unfettered borders and domestic movements of people, right, who are citizens, who don't think about their movements impulsively and who have passports and can go south into Mexico, north into Canada. But you also have a number of people who are undocumented, who cannot move without experiencing possibly a lot of peril about returning home. And then, of course, you have de facto a closed border to refugee and asylee claims that is creating a humanitarian crisis in northern Mexico.
Now, that makes me think of something that I encounter a lot in my life as a service worker, mm-hmm. where I definitely benefit from the out in front, better paying jobs in the service industry, mm-hmm. and my wealthy patrons that pay my tips generally. A lot of them are in their votes mm-hmm. and in their bar talk right. are violently anti-immigrant mm-hmm. and violently anti-Mexican in particular, because this is California and anyone that looks Latin American is just called Mexican by these people.
Right.
And at the same time, they know who's working in the kitchen. And they have this like cognitive dissonance about the fact that they can sit there and spend money at businesses and then know that and then pretend that somehow they're not contributing to the same thing. But what I do want to ask you about is the fact that people I know that work 2 or 3 jobs, or they have a decent job and they're here without all the necessary paperwork, told that they need to have. I'll say I'm going on vacation to Colombia, and they are not able to move freely. What you spoke about with the EU, that makes me think very hard about that, is that they are here working hard, living their life, whatever. They can't really go back to Mexico because it might be very difficult to get back in.
Right.
And they also can't get on a plane and spend any of that money that they make to go to Hawaii or to go to Europe on vacation. And they're essentially, in a certain way,
even
prisoners. This might sound hyperbolic to some people that'll criticize me, but they're essentially seen by me as prisoners here. Because they come here to work, but now they can't go anywhere.
Right. So what we're seeing is, domestically, is a movement of the border policing that usually we think about as at our national borders, so Mexico and the United States and Canada and the United States. But that type of policing since the mid-1990s has radiated in the interior parts of the United States. So we see extended border control mechanisms like stops in the domestic space of the United States. So we see these patrols, we see more border patrols, we see stops, etc. And for people who are undocumented or are unsure of their status, okay, they can be permanent resident aliens and still feel that they are trapped in a domestic or county space because of their status. And because of this border control that's radiating up from traditional places like our international boundary are so common these days that it does trap people into just, selective movements. And those are really circumscribed movements within a county, within cities, etc.
And so when you go across state lines and they casually ask, I'll tell you, they very casually ask me, do you have any fruits and vegetables that might carry parasites in? And I'm like, no. And I usually do have some groceries in the car, but they're never going to question me. Do you see that becoming a border control issue? Do people get asked for citizenship-related paperwork?
You bet. Those mechanisms of internal border control have been quite ubiquitous since, again, the mid-1990s. In California, this goes back to the 1970s. And there have been some constitutional challenges, namely by the ACLU, but nonetheless, border control unconstitutionally can stop. And they do stop. And they can ask questions like, let me see your passport or driver's license, or something as benign as, what type of fruit are you carrying in your car? Nonetheless, that represents a stop, okay, a border control mechanism that may be benign if you carry white privilege, okay, but could cause all sorts of anxiety triggers if you are an ethnic minority, an African-American person, because this is a policing mechanism, an undocumented person or a person with, as a permanent resident alien with papers that are not updated, or you have forgotten your green card, or you don't have your passport, etc. So that whole landscape of anxiety, that deportability, okay, of people who are of Latinx origin, is something that can't be diminished. And again, it does foreshorten, circumscribe movements of people in the everyday.
And what is your view on the double standard in that way? In that last paragraph, you had white privilege, triggered, and ethnic minority. I think that hits the UCSC bingo. But what do you feel in your studies and your just experience as a person living in very white mid-county Santa Cruz County feel about the double standard right now for white privilege as far as immigration goes, in the sense of we are not worried about the Canadian border or people coming in from Northern Europe or any of these areas? How do you approach that as either a professor or as just yourself as a general human being?
Right. So, the pat answer and the local answer would be, oh, this is just a manifestation of white privilege and white supremacy. But I, as a historian, know that these are relationships that are very complicated, that come out of history and the treatment of border controls that are uneven, and that are consequences of U.S. imperialism and a fight with Mexico in the 1840s, 1846 to 1848, which was a war of conquest, which, of course, was not similarly waged in Canada, that created the political line between Mexico and the United States, whereas a political line between Canada and the United States was one of diplomacy, organized around sort of respect for the British Empire and white Canadians.
Aww.
So we have, as a result, different types of approaches to and relationships to people from Latin America, Mexico in particular, and Canada, and Canadians in particular, that are really historical, based in imperialism, based in sort of 150 years of border control and foreign relations that lead us to the present moment. One of which, of course, is racializing Mexicans as others, as non-white, versus people from Canada, and white migration from Canada as, well, Anglo-Saxon. So it's an imbalance historically that I think we need to pay more attention to, but it resonates presently as, in the American imaginary, as really one border. When we think of border control, we think of this one border we have with Mexico. We never ask the same questions or have the same curiosities about the northern border with Canada.
Yeah, it was pretty easy for me to get through the Canadian border last time that I went up there.
Right.
But also another double standard that I did mention in our correspondence, is something that struck me last year when they talked about some raid, I think in Iowa, of a home and garden supply store, which was a big place because they arrested over 100 employees all at once that were working there at that moment. And the business, I was wondering, they said, oh, the business owner wasn't there, but we're going to contact them later. And I was like, I'm going to follow up on this. And I've been following up on it, and I'm thinking it was called Corsos. And I was like, is Corsos ever going to get charges brought against them? And it's not picking on them. I just see you looking up stuff. And this happens all the time where I'm like, I wonder if this raid of 7-Elevens across the country that happened a few months ago is going to result in any of the employers even being told, like, hey, why didn't you check whether or not your workers were allowed to work here? All the workers get arrested, being my point, and the employers never have charges brought against them. And then in my research, I found SB 1070 has this little bit in Arizona at the bottom where employers can basically use the drug dealer joke defense of, if you're a cop, you have to tell me. And they are exempt from having any charges brought to them for knowingly employing people without the necessary paperwork to be working here. I'm not saying that these people shouldn't get hired, but if we're going to arrest the workers, can't we have less of a double standard for people that are rich enough to own a business? And how do you go about that in advocating for policies to change in that regard?
Well, capital needs workers, and capitalism thrives when workers are not able to protect themselves in the workplace. They're made much more vulnerable and exploitable. And so the skeptic in me says, well, capitalism in our country really depends on undocumented immigrants to have these vulnerabilities and their deportability, which makes them, of course, easier to exploit. Now, I think that's uncontested. There are laws. In 1996, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed that was supposed to sanction or punish employers who hired undocumented people. This is why when we get jobs and we go for an interview and we get the job, we are asked to fill out an I-9 form, which is supposed to be the documentation in which to prove our worthiness, our legality for employment. But ultimately, the I-9 form goes through the HR of the business that you're hired for, and they are charged with following up on the veracity of what they see on your I-9.
So there's no government office that follows up on that?
Absolutely no. It's something that businesses do. Now, there's E-Verify. That's another thing that goes on that as a result of this failed I-9 vetting on the part of businesses. But, there are businesses who don't use E-Verify, but there are state and local jobs that use E-Verify. UC Santa Cruz uses E-Verify. But where we're seeing these raids, it's happening on a level of blue-collar work, industrial work, labor that is dirty and dangerous, where employers will not go through their obligations, their remit to check for the status of their workers. Because, again, it is in their interest to deploy a tractable, vulnerable set of individuals who can claim very few rights toward exploitation, whether or not it's delayed payment or no payment or underpayment. It works for employers. And I think, again, that's totally undisputed. These raids at workplaces have always happened, and they've happened. And let's make no mistake and no apologies for President Obama, who earned the reputation as being the deporter-in-chief. He, in fact, had deported in his first administration, or years in his administration, from 2009 to 2012, more people than President Trump has currently deported. Okay, so, but I'm not making any apologies for Trump at all. Trump has only been in office for 3 years, 2 years, 2.5, 3 years?
I'm pretty sure it's been 500 years.
I think it feels like 1,000 years, okay? But nonetheless, we have to be more critical of our deportation policies than the presidents who wield this and then turn away because of people like you and I who are activists, who are on the streets, who work with organizations for labor and human and immigrant rights, who are fighting against deportation. It is not, an olive branch by Obama that in his second administration that DACA and the Dreamers were given much more political space and rights. Nor is it a coincidence that California, which was a regressive state when I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, who brought us one of the most pernicious, regressive anti-immigrant bills, Proposition 187, 30 years later becomes really an outlier, a progressive outlier in the states for immigrant rights, including, lately, the protection of children who are undocumented to receive health care under this current governor. So, we live in waves again, and history is again, doesn't repeat but has rhymes. And some of these rhymes are ugly, and some of them have been diminished. And some of them are replaced with more progressive sorts of waves of politics and policies. And we're experiencing that in California. But I want to go back to that guy that in the bar who you as a person overhearing their conversation. California is not safely a pro-immigrant state. If you take a look at, and I encourage your viewers to do this, any sort of political mapping of California, you're going to see very typically on the coast, especially in Santa Cruz County, the bluest of the bluest counties in the nation, all the progressive liberal voting patterns are on the coast. But if you look just to the east of us in, Bakersfield, Fresno, Riverside County, all the way north, you're going to see
Noon's country.
Red. And I think we're hanging by a thread in California.
Well, that's also the most extreme of both sides.
Right. So you see, even within California,
the Tea Party founding is the same. The Deep South, basically, of Fresno and Bakersfield,
right
next to the coast.
In Southern California, they say the Mason-Dixon line ends at Riverside County. California. There are two Californias, and the border really is one that runs not north to south, but east to west. And so, although politically we are living in a progressive moment for immigrant rights and labor rights, just 20 and 30 years ago, it was exactly the opposite. And the politics of California, again, are not that entrenched progressively. We have a lot of work, in other words, to do in California to move the immigrant debate, labor rights debate, human rights debate more progressively than I think than we anticipate or think.
Well, thank you so much. I have so many more questions for you. Looks like homelessness and immigration may take up more of my episodes than I ever planned to. But this has been Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu here with Professor Grace Peña Delgado. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome.
And her third book is Making the Chinese Mexican. That's Making the Chinese Mexican, 2012 published book by UCSC professor Grace Peña Delgado. This has been Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu. I got to get out of here. A little bit of Do Make Say Think. Then we got DJ Gina coming in with Oiko. And DJ Gina's on all day today. So she'll be playing some music later too. Thank you guys so much for listening. KZSC Santa Cruz, Dan Wu, Unquestionable, out.